You can sit at the kids' table, Eleanor. It'll be easier for everyone. My daughter-in-law Ashley said it so casually that at first I thought she was joking. Thanksgiving dinner had always been loud in our family. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house, sweet potatoes with melted marshmallows steamed on the counter, and the television in the living room hummed quietly with a football pregame show. For 72 years I had sat at the same long oak table during Thanksgiving, usually at the end where my late husband Robert once carved the turkey with slow, careful hands. But that afternoon Ashley pointed toward the small folding table in the corner of the dining room where my grandson Ben and his younger cousins were already stacking plastic cups and arguing about whose turn it was to pour the apple cider. For a moment the room went strangely quiet, as if everyone was waiting to see what I would do. My son Jason cleared his throat but didn't say anything. My sister-in-law looked down at her napkin. Someone chuckled awkwardly. Ashley kept smiling, the same polite smile she used when explaining why family traditions needed to change. The kids love having Grandma over there, she added, waving her hand lightly as if she were doing me a favor. I felt every pair of eyes flicker toward me and then quickly away. The adult table was already set with polished silverware and tall wine glasses, the kind we only brought out for holidays. The kids' table had paper plates with cartoon turkeys printed on them. For a second, I considered saying something. I could have reminded them that this house used to be mine before Jason and Ashley moved in last year, or that I had hosted Thanksgiving dinners here for nearly 4 decades. But I simply smiled. It was the same calm smile I had practiced through many uncomfortable moments over the past year, the kind that kept the peace even when peace didn't really exist. Of course, I said gently, walking toward the smaller table. Ben scooted his chair to make room for me and grinned up at me with cranberry sauce already on his cheek. The children resumed their chatter immediately, relieved that the strange tension among the adults had dissolved. I poured myself a glass of apple cider from a plastic pitcher and listened to the muffled conversations drifting from the big table behind me. Forks clinked against china. Someone laughed loudly at a joke I couldn't quite hear. The television volume rose slightly as the football announcer switched to a special news segment between commercials. I didn't pay much attention at first. The kids were debating whether pumpkin pie or pecan pie was better, and I was busy helping Ben cut his turkey into smaller pieces. But then I heard something from the TV that made my hand pause in midair. A voice from the broadcast said a name I had carried for more than 70 years. My name. I slowly lifted my head toward the television, convinced for a moment that I must have misheard it. The children around me kept talking about pumpkin pie and football, completely unaware that the air in the room had suddenly shifted. But the voice on the television repeated the name again, clearer this time, and there was no mistaking it. Eleanor Whitmore. My name echoed softly from the living room, carried through the doorway by the steady voice of the news anchor. I set down my fork and looked toward the adults at the large table. Most of them had not noticed yet. Ashley was in the middle of telling a story about her new yoga class, using wide gestures with her hands while everyone nodded politely. My son Jason was pouring himself another glass of wine, his attention fixed on the conversation instead of the television. Only my grandson Ben noticed that I had gone still. He looked up at me with curious eyes and asked quietly, "Grandma, are you okay?" I gave him a small smile and patted his shoulder. "I am fine, sweetheart," I said gently, though my heart had begun to beat a little faster. The television volume rose again as the segment continued, and now the adults began to hear it as well. The anchor explained that the evening broadcast was highlighting recipients of a National Community Service Award, an honor given to individuals who had quietly helped their communities in extraordinary ways. The camera cut to images of schools, parks, and smiling children from different towns across the country. Then the anchor said my name again, this time followed by the words 72-year-old Eleanor Whitmore from Cedar Ridge, Illinois. A fork clinked loudly against a plate at the adult table. Ashley's voice stopped in the middle of her sentence. Jason slowly turned his head toward the living room. The room that had been filled with the warm noise of Thanksgiving dinner only seconds earlier grew strangely quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft tapping of rain against the window. Everyone began to listen. The anchor continued speaking calmly, describing how one woman in a small Midwestern town had spent decades supporting local schools, community shelters, and youth programs without ever seeking recognition. Old photographs appeared on the screen, showing children at summer reading camps and families standing in front of newly renovated playgrounds. I recognized many of the places instantly. The small library on Pine Street. The after-school program near Maple Avenue. The community shelter beside the old train station. Each image carried a memory I had never spoken about at this table. At the adult table, Ashley slowly pushed back her chair and leaned toward the television. Jason stood up halfway from his seat, his eyes fixed on the screen as if he was trying to understand something that did not quite make sense. My sister-in-law whispered, "Did they just say Eleanor Whitmore?" I could feel the weight of several confused glances turning toward the small table where I still sat beside the children, holding a plastic cup of apple cider. Ben looked between me and the television, clearly puzzled. "Grandma," he asked softly, "why are they talking about you on the news?" For a moment I did not answer Ben's question because the voice from the television continued speaking, steady and calm, filling the quiet space of the dining room. The anchor explained that the award being announced that evening recognized individuals who had spent years improving their communities without ever asking for recognition. The program showed photographs of volunteers, teachers, and ordinary citizens who had quietly changed the lives of people around them. Then the camera returned to the anchor, who smiled warmly and said that one of the most remarkable stories came from a small town called Cedar Ridge. At the adult table, someone turned the television volume higher. The soft hum of conversation had completely disappeared now. Every chair was facing the living room. The children beside me had stopped eating and were staring at the screen with open curiosity. I remained seated, my hands folded loosely in my lap, listening to the description that followed. The anchor explained that for more than 25 years an anonymous donor had quietly supported youth programs across the town. Libraries had been repaired. Scholarships had been created for students whose families could not afford college. A small wing of the local community center had been built so children would have a safe place to study after school. Each project had appeared quietly, always funded through a modest foundation created in memory of a man named Robert Whitmore. Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud after so many years felt like the soft opening of an old door in my memory. Robert had believed deeply in helping people without expecting applause. When he passed away 12 years earlier, I had simply continued the work we started together. No announcements, no ceremonies, just small steps that slowly added up over time. On the television, the anchor continued explaining that the identity of the donor had remained unknown for decades until a local organization recently nominated her for a national recognition award. Then the words that followed made several people at the adult table gasp quietly. The anchor said that the woman responsible for those contributions was 72-year-old Eleanor Whitmore, a lifelong resident of Cedar Ridge who believed that kindness should speak for itself. At the adult table, my son Jason slowly lowered his wine glass onto the tablecloth. Ashley stood completely still beside her chair, staring toward the television as if the broadcast might suddenly change its story. My sister-in-law placed her hand over her mouth in surprise. Across the room I could feel their eyes shifting toward the small table where I was still seated among the children, a paper napkin resting beside my plate and a plastic cup of apple cider in my hand. Ben leaned closer and whispered again, his voice full of amazement. "Grandma, they are really talking about you." I gave him the same calm smile I had worn all evening. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly, finally turning my eyes toward the television screen where my husband's photograph had just appeared beside my name. "It seems they are." No one spoke for several seconds after the broadcast showed Robert's photograph beside my name. The children at the small table looked from the television to the adults and back again, sensing that something important had just happened even if they did not fully understand it. At the large table the quiet was heavy, almost uncomfortable, the kind of silence that appears when people suddenly realize they have misunderstood something important. My son Jason was the first to move. He slowly walked toward the living room doorway, his eyes still fixed on the television screen where the news anchor continued describing the projects that had quietly appeared around Cedar Ridge over the past 2 decades. Ashley followed him a few steps behind, her confident posture from earlier replaced by a tight stillness. I remained seated at the children's table, gently folding my napkin while the broadcast continued. The anchor explained that the scholarship program funded in Robert Whitmore's name had helped dozens of local students attend college. Several young adults appeared briefly on the screen, smiling as they spoke about how the support had allowed them to study teaching, engineering, and nursing. I recognized 2 of them immediately. One had worked part-time at the grocery store near my street when he was 16 years old. Another had once helped carry groceries to my car during a snowstorm years ago. None of them had known who the donor was. That had always been the point. Robert used to say that generosity should travel quietly, like sunlight through a window, warming people without demanding attention. When he passed away 12 years earlier, I simply continued what we had started together. Each year I reviewed the foundation records, made a few careful decisions, and signed the paperwork. No celebrations, no speeches, just quiet progress. At the adult table my sister-in-law slowly walked closer to the television and whispered something to Jason that I could not hear. Ashley stood beside him with her arms folded, watching the screen as if the story might suddenly correct itself. But the anchor's voice remained steady and clear. The program explained that the woman responsible for the donations had never once appeared publicly to claim recognition. Instead, she had continued living quietly in the same small town where she grew up, attending community events, volunteering at local libraries, and helping neighbors when they needed assistance. As those words filled the room, I could feel the attention of every adult turning toward the small table again. Their expressions had changed completely from the polite amusement I saw earlier in the evening. Now there was confusion, surprise, and something else that looked very much like realization. My grandson Ben tugged gently at my sleeve and whispered with wide eyes, "Grandma, why did you never tell us any of this?" I placed my hand softly over his and gave him a warm smile. "Because some things are more meaningful when they are done quietly," I said in a calm voice. Across the room Jason slowly approached the small table, his footsteps careful as if he were walking into unfamiliar territory inside his own home. Jason stopped beside the children's table and for a moment he simply looked at me, as if he were seeing something unfamiliar in a place that had always felt ordinary to him. The television continued speaking in the background, the anchor now explaining that the National Committee had decided to recognize the woman behind the Cedar Ridge Foundation during a live segment that evening. Images of the community center appeared again on the screen, followed by a photograph of the small reading room that had been added to the town library 5 years earlier. I remembered the day the construction finished. The librarian had shaken my hand and thanked the foundation without ever asking who was behind it. That had always made me smile. Jason finally pulled out a chair at the children's table and sat down across from me. It was the first time all evening that he had chosen that seat. His expression was careful and uncertain. "Mom," he said slowly, "is all of that really about you?" The children around us watched the conversation with wide, curious eyes. I nodded gently. "Your father and I started helping the town a long time ago," I said in a calm voice. "After he passed away, I simply continued the work." Jason glanced toward the television again where the news segment showed several students standing in front of the Cedar Ridge High School building. One of them was holding a small plaque with the Whitmore Foundation name engraved at the bottom. I could see Jason quietly calculating the years in his mind. 25 years of projects. Scholarships. Renovations. Quiet donations. Ashley slowly approached the table behind him but did not sit down. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the television and then looking back at me as if she were trying to measure something she had not noticed before. Earlier that evening she had spoken with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed she understood exactly how the family worked. Now that certainty had disappeared, Jason rubbed his forehead and gave a quiet breath of disbelief. "Mom, why did you never tell me any of this?" he asked. His voice was not angry. It was something closer to confusion, mixed with a realization that had arrived much later than it should have. I folded my hands calmly on the table beside the children's paper plates and plastic cups. "Because your father always believed that kindness should never become a performance," I replied. "The moment people start helping others for applause, the meaning quietly disappears." At the television, the anchor announced that the committee had invited the award recipient to attend a ceremony in Chicago the following month. The broadcast ended with a photograph of Robert and me standing together many years earlier at a small community fundraiser. I had almost forgotten that picture existed. When the screen returned to the regular football program, the room remained silent for a long moment. The children slowly returned to their meals, but the adults stood still around the room as if the dinner they had planned had suddenly become something very different from what they expected. Jason looked down at the children's table, then at the empty chair beside him, and finally back at me with an expression that carried both pride and a quiet kind of regret. I could see the moment the realization settled over the room like a quiet snowfall. No one raised their voice and no one argued. Instead, the adults stood around the dining room with that strange mixture of surprise and embarrassment that appears when people suddenly discover that the story they believed about someone was never the full truth. Jason remained seated across from me at the children's table, turning his wedding ring slowly around his finger the way he used to do when he was thinking hard about something. Ashley still stood behind him with her arms folded, though the confident posture she carried earlier had softened into something more uncertain. The children returned to their meals with the natural resilience that only children have, discussing football again and comparing which pie they planned to eat first. I listened to their chatter while quietly sipping my apple cider. The house still smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, but the atmosphere had shifted into something thoughtful and reflective. Jason finally leaned forward and rested his elbows on the small table, looking directly at me with a seriousness I had not seen in him for a long time. "Mom," he said slowly, "all those scholarships they mentioned on the news, were those really funded by you and Dad all these years?" I nodded once. "Your father believed that every child deserves an opportunity to build a good life," I replied. "When we were young, we did not have much money ourselves, but we promised each other that if we ever had the ability to help others, we would do it quietly." Jason let out a slow breath and glanced toward the television again as if trying to connect the calm woman sitting at the children's table with the person the news anchor had just described. Around the room, several relatives began whispering softly to one another, sharing the same question that Jason had just asked me. Ashley finally pulled out a chair beside him and sat down, though she did not meet my eyes right away. Instead, she stared at the paper turkey printed on the children's plate in front of her as if it had suddenly become very interesting. "Eleanor," she said carefully after a moment, "that foundation they mentioned, how long has it been operating?" Her voice carried a cautious politeness that was very different from the cheerful authority she used earlier in the evening. I placed my hands gently on the table and considered the question. "Robert and I started the first fund about 27 years ago," I answered. At the beginning it only helped 2 students attend community college. Over time the program grew as we added more scholarships and community projects. Ashley lifted her eyes slowly, clearly calculating the timeline in her mind. 27 years was long before she had even met Jason. Around us the adults began quietly returning to their seats, though the large dining table no longer seemed quite as important as it did earlier. Jason looked down at the small table again, then at the chair beside me where one of the children had stepped away to refill his drink. After a long thoughtful pause he reached for that chair and gently pulled it closer to the table where I sat. Jason slowly pulled the empty chair closer to the children's table and sat down beside me. It was a small movement, almost quiet, but everyone in the room noticed it immediately. The children looked up from their plates with curiosity, and several adults at the larger table paused in the middle of their conversations. A few minutes earlier, this small folding table had been treated like a polite place to move someone out of the way. Now it had quietly become the center of the room. Jason rested his hands on the edge of the table and looked around as if he were seeing the house differently for the first time. "Mom," he said carefully, "I do not think I ever realized how much you and Dad were doing all those years." His voice was softer than usual, and there was a thoughtful weight behind his words. I gave him a calm smile. "Your father always believed that helping people should never become a family headline," I replied. "We did not want our work to become something people talked about at dinner." Across the room, Ashley shifted slightly in her chair. The confident energy she had carried earlier had completely faded, replaced by a quiet attentiveness that had not been there before. She looked around the dining room as if she were suddenly aware of the way everyone was now looking toward the children's table instead of the large one. My sister-in-law cleared her throat and spoke gently from the other side of the room. "Eleanor, the news said the foundation helped dozens of students. That must have taken a great deal of planning." I nodded slightly. "It did," I said. "But your brother helped create the structure before he passed away. Once the program was in place, it simply required patience and careful decisions each year." Jason leaned back in his chair, absorbing the explanation slowly. I could see memories passing through his mind. The weekends when Robert and I attended community meetings. The quiet envelopes we mailed during scholarship season. The small events at the library where we sometimes volunteered together. At the time, those moments had probably seemed ordinary to him. Now they were beginning to connect into a larger picture. One of the younger cousins looked at Jason and asked innocently, "Does that mean Grandma is famous now?" The question caused a few quiet smiles around the room. I shook my head gently. "No, sweetheart," I said kindly. "It simply means people learned about something that was already happening." The television in the living room had returned to the football game, but no one was watching it anymore. Instead, the attention of the entire house remained focused on the small table where I sat among the children. Jason looked down at the paper plates and plastic cups arranged around us and gave a quiet, thoughtful laugh. "You know," he said slowly, "I think this might actually be the most important table in the house tonight." I picked up my fork again and continued eating my dinner with the same calm rhythm I had used all evening, but I could feel the atmosphere of the room changing in a way that did not require anyone to raise their voice or explain anything further. The conversation around the room slowly began again, but it no longer sounded the same as it had earlier that evening. The laughter was softer now, more thoughtful, as if everyone was carefully choosing their words. Several relatives who had been seated at the large table quietly carried their plates over and joined the smaller one, pulling extra chairs from the living room so they could sit nearby. The children seemed delighted by the sudden expansion of their table, happily sliding their cups aside to make room. Jason remained beside me, occasionally glancing at the television even though the program had already moved on to football highlights. After a moment, he leaned closer and spoke in a quieter voice meant only for me. "Mom, I think I owe you an apology," he said slowly. I shook my head gently before he could continue. "You do not owe me anything," I replied calmly. "Families misunderstand each other sometimes. What matters is how we move forward." Jason nodded, though the thoughtful expression remained on his face. Across the table, Ashley was unusually quiet. Earlier she had led the conversation with effortless confidence, guiding everyone from topic to topic the way hosts often do during holidays. Now she listened instead of speaking, watching the room carefully as if she were noticing details she had overlooked before. After a few minutes she cleared her throat softly. "Eleanor," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I hope you understand that earlier tonight we were only trying to keep things organized with the seating." Her explanation was polite, though it carried a hint of uncertainty. I met her eyes and gave a calm smile. "I understand completely," I said. "Thanksgiving dinners can become crowded." The answer seemed to ease some of the tension in her shoulders, though she remained thoughtful for the rest of the conversation. Around us the evening continued in a gentler rhythm. The children finished their meals and began talking excitedly about dessert. My sister-in-law brought the pumpkin pies to the table while someone else poured coffee for the adults. The smell of cinnamon and fresh crust filled the room, wrapping the house in the warm comfort that holidays are meant to create. Yet beneath that familiar atmosphere there was a new awareness moving quietly through the room. People asked questions about the foundation. Jason listened closely whenever I spoke, occasionally nodding as small pieces of the past began fitting together in his mind. Even Ashley seemed curious now, leaning forward when I described how Robert and I had started with just 2 scholarships many years earlier. No one mentioned the seating arrangement again, but the shift in the room was obvious to everyone present. By the time dessert plates were passed around, the large dining table stood nearly empty while most of the family gathered around the children's table instead. I watched them with quiet amusement, noticing how naturally the conversation flowed when people simply shared space without worrying about where they were supposed to sit. Jason glanced around the room and smiled thoughtfully. "You know," he said after a moment, "this might be the first Thanksgiving where everyone is actually sitting together." I took a small bite of pumpkin pie and nodded softly, feeling the warmth of the evening settle gently around the table. The evening slowly settled into a quiet warmth that felt different from the tense beginning of the dinner. Plates had been cleared away and the last slices of pumpkin pie were disappearing from the table while the children talked about their plans for winter break. Outside the window the November night had grown darker and colder, but inside the house the lights from the dining room and kitchen created a soft golden glow across the table. I watched my family sitting together around the smaller table, their chairs pulled close so that everyone could fit, and it reminded me of the early years when Robert and I first started hosting holidays in this house. Back then we did not have much space or money, but everyone sat together anyway because being close mattered more than having the perfect arrangement. Jason leaned back in his chair and looked around the room again with the same thoughtful expression he had worn for most of the evening. It seemed as if he were quietly revisiting memories from years ago, connecting moments that once seemed ordinary with the story he had just heard on the news. After a while he turned toward me and spoke in a steady voice that carried easily across the table. "Mom, when the ceremony happens next month in Chicago, I would like to be there with you." His words were simple but sincere. I could hear the pride in them, mixed with the quiet understanding that had taken years to arrive. I gave him a gentle nod. "That would make your father very happy," I replied. Ashley sat beside him listening closely. She looked at me for a moment before speaking, her tone respectful and calm. "Eleanor, I hope you know that everyone here is proud of what you and Robert built." The room grew still again, though this time the silence felt warm instead of uncomfortable. I smiled softly at her and then glanced at the photograph of Robert that hung on the far wall of the dining room. The picture had been taken many years earlier at a small community fundraiser, long before anyone imagined that the work we began would grow into something larger than ourselves. I had never needed recognition for those years of quiet effort, but seeing my family understand the meaning behind it felt like a gentle closing of a circle that had been open for a long time. The children soon gathered their empty plates and carried them toward the kitchen, laughing as they competed to see who could stack them the highest. Jason helped push the chairs back into place while relatives prepared to leave for the night. Before anyone stepped out the door he paused beside the small table and looked at me with a warm smile. "Next year," he said thoughtfully, "we are setting one long table for everyone." I chuckled softly and reached for my coat from the back of the chair. "That sounds like a wonderful plan," I answered. As the family slowly moved toward the living room and the quiet house settled again, I glanced once more at the small table where the evening had truly begun. Sometimes the most important lessons arrive in simple moments, not through arguments or grand speeches but through the quiet realization that respect, like kindness, grows stronger when it is shared.